What's up, cooks? Welcome to the Card Kitchen. I am the Card Chef, and today we are cooking up the top 10 decks of the week. That's right, top 10 decks of the week. Now, this usually is not a meta report. However, it is starting to evolve into that weekly, week after week. It's not always going to be like the top 10 decks based on what I think the top decks are, based on how they've been performing. However, a lot of these decks have topped in pretty big tournaments with at least 200 players or more and continue to top. And so I would just like to highlight them going forward. And let's just follow and see where these decks go in the future. These might also just be decks that have dropped into the scene, not necessarily the meta scene because of new card drops such as Jigglypuff or Haunter, or just from the drop event in general. So with that being said, let's get into the top 10 decks of the week that I would like to spotlight. First deck we want to talk about is the Charizard Arcanine deck, and it's being called a couple of things. I call it Charcanine just because it seems to roll off the tongue a little bit better. I know other people call it some other things. You can call it whatever you want, to be honest. But this deck is clearly becoming the top Charizard deck in the game. Previously, last week, we talked about how Charizard was starting to add Baby Charizard into the deck, and we were wondering if that was going to start to become the new fire deck in the meta. But then right after I posted that, a huge tournament finished with this deck, and now this deck has been doing insanely good. In fact, it won, I believe, two humongous tournaments this past week. In fact, one of the tournaments that it won, it was actually a mirror match between both of the exact same decks. Now, this deck is super duper good for a couple of reasons. One, it combines both the Arcanine and Charizard in the same deck. And the reason why you are doing this is because when you're in the Pikachu matchup, you want to be able to focus on getting that Arcanine loaded up so you can one-shot that Pikachu, and then you only have one prize left to get. Whereas in like the other matchups against things like Charizard Mirror Match or the Mewtwo, where you need to be able to build up to that Charizard EX so you can one-shot those Mewtwo's. And so it's super important into the two top decks. And now the two top decks being Pikachu and Mewtwo currently, but now this really seems to be coming in as a top viable deck. I don't think it's S tier just yet, but it's certainly getting there. And I also did a recent like meta report. I called it the current state of the meta in Pokemon Pocket right now, and it was I think a week or two ago, and it was basically talking about how Pikachu and Mewtwo are going to stay at the top, and the only way we are going to see any type of change is either one, if new cards come in, or if other decks start to come out of the meta. So because Pikachu is so strong, I theorize that water decks are going to start to decline slowly but surely, and that is definitely the case. And the majority of the tournaments that happened this week, especially the really big ones, the water decks were like 7% or less of any of the top decks that were performing last week. And so because there's such a huge decline, you have a pretty big uptick and fire, which is around the 17, 18 to 19% representation. A lot of people are still playing just the Charizard Moltres, but it does not seem to be topping really in that top 16 at all, whereas this deck really seems to be getting multiple tops right now. So I think the only way this deck drops is if people start playing a lot of water, and I'm not really sure that's going to happen because Pikachu is still so strong. However, we are going to get into a bunch of water decks and where water decks seem to be going. And with that being said, let's get into deck number 2. So the next deck we want to talk about is another Charizard Moltres deck, and it seems to be the almost the exact same build as the Arcanine Charizard build, except you're replacing the Arcanine with Scorch, and this is pretty much like a pretty good idea, I honestly think, because Arcanine, Moltres, and Charizard are all EX Pokemon. This deck is strong as, or the Arcanine version is so strong. However, because every main card you're playing is an EX, you can easily lose games if aggro decks just completely wipe out your Pokemon. So like aggro decks like Starmie and Pikachu, they can easily get those 3 points that they need because the majority of the Pokemon you're playing are EX Pokemon. By playing the Centiskorch in place of the Arcanine, you're kind of allowing yourself to maybe only lose one prize at the beginning and then make up for it by bringing in a loaded up Charizard. It does take a lot more, well, not a lot more, but it takes one more energy, which it also discards. However, it is doing 130 damage, so not only are you one-shot in Pikachu's, but you're also one-shot in Starmies as well as Zapdoses. So it might actually be a pretty good idea in the future if this is what you want to do. And it also has 130 HP, which basically is the same as Arcanine when you consider when Arcanine does attack, it actually minuses 20 from itself. And if it gets a second attack off, it minuses 20 again. So it's kind of an even trade. So I'd like to see where this goes. And if people actually start to pick it up, this did top in a tournament this week with 200 or more people. And so I wonder if this is going to start to get noticed. And maybe if people pick this up and start to play it more than the Arcanine. I'm not sure if they will, but it would be interesting to see. And with that being said, let's get into deck number 3. So the next deck we want to talk about is a Pikachu EX deck. And previously we were talking about how Raichu seemed to be moving in the direction of that one being the definitive version of the Pikachu decks. The reason for that and why it was going up in the meta is because Mewtwo was going up in the meta, and so you really needed that answer to the Mewtwo, and that answer was the Raichu. It was a tremendous finisher with 140 damage output, with potentially being 150, which would take out Mewtwo exactly with a Giovanni. Now with the resurgence of Charizard decks, these Pikachu decks need to start being a lot more aggressive again, and so the Electrode allows you to do that. It attacks for 70 damage for only 2 energy requirement and has a free retreat cost, which is super beneficial in a deck like this. You're also up against things like Moltres, Zapdos, and Articuno, as well as any other water decks in the meta right now, and so you're just able to take out decks a lot faster, especially the Charizard and Mewtwo. It's super important to get rid of those Mewtwo's, Charizards, Moltreses, or Gardevoirs as quickly as possible before they get online, and it's a lot easier to do with an Electro build when you're up against these Stage 2 decks. This deck is also playing, for some reason, an Electabuzz. It's usually the 7th basic is a Pinchurin. I think that's how you pronounce it. However, the player decided to play an Electabuzz in this one, and I'm not sure I exactly agree. However, it did seem to top twice in the finals this week, once getting second and once winning a tournament. In both of those tournaments, I believe, are 800 or plus player. So it does seem we are starting to get back to the Electro builds again so that they can take out the new Charizard decks in the meta. And with that being said, let's get into deck number 4. Next deck we want to talk about is a Greninja deck, and this is super interesting for water decks right now because previously last week we talked about 2 different water decks, and they were both Greninja decks, one being a Starmie EX Greninja build and one being an Articuno EX Greninja build. Both of those decks are still doing very good, and both of them are placing in top 16s right now, as well as Starmie EX, Articuno EX decks. They haven't been placing recently. However, the past week they have started to place a little bit more. In fact, you're starting to see like 3 or 4 water decks in each top 16 now, which is super interesting. And it's probably due to the fact that fire is coming up in the meta. So, like I said last time, the water decks are going to slowly go down, and because of that, you're going to see a rise in fire. But now, because you see a rise in fire, you're definitely going to start to see water come back up again. It's going to be a lot harder for them to do the water decks because Pikachu doesn't really seem to be going anywhere. However, it does seem to be that the water builds are taking a little. I don't even know if it's less of an aggressive attack by playing Greninja builds, because it seems like those are the best performing ones right now. Because it's a stage 2, I would call it less aggressive. However, the fact that you have a Greninja on board and you can put that additional damage, it is like you're being extra aggressive, but at a little bit slower of a pace. This deck specifically I want to talk about is a Mewtwo build. Now, the build I was going to talk about was a baby Mewtwo build, which I believe that player did not play Psychic Energy and was just using it as a tank. Baby Mewtwo has started to pop up as a new tank in Pokemon Pocket over things like Snorlax and Kangaskhan because of its 120 HP and only 2 retreat costs. You're basically getting a higher HP and a lower retreat cost than the Kangaskhan, and usually because Kangaskhan can often just flip tails, you're attacking for 0 damage anyway, so you're not really losing anything. However, this build is playing a Mewtwo EX, and I do believe this person is most likely playing Psychic Energy in this. But I could be wrong. I'm not really sure. I would doubt that they're going to use a Mewtwo EX as a tank when it's an EX Pokemon, but you never know. If that is the reason, then it could be very well that they are just attacking in with the Greninja and the Kangaskhan. However, nevertheless, it's just interesting to see that Greninja is starting to really get his kind of showcase in the meta, and it seems to be that water decks in general, all the best ones that seem to be topping, more often than not, seem to have a Greninja in it now. This card, by the way, is a card that has also previously been in the paper TCG, and when it was in the paper TCG during that time of the meta, this card was super duper strong, and it was super duper strong with basically the same. It was only 20 damage. Actually, I think it might have even been less. It might have been 10 damage counters. And it was in top decks at the time. So, in a way stronger meta than the metas we're looking at in Pokemon TCG Pocket. So, not much more to say about this deck other than the fact that Greninja decks seem to be doing really good. In fact, I got one more Greninja deck for you, and we'll get into that deck right now. The next deck I want to talk about is another Greninja deck, and it's a Greninja Wigglytuff deck, and this deck got 3rd place in a tournament this past week with at least 200 or more players. It might have even been 250. I can't exactly remember. I just looked at them, but I was looking at so much data. But it's super interesting for 2 reasons. One, we were just talking about Greninja in the last deck and how Greninja is clearly being put into a lot of water decks, which is making those water decks seem to be a lot better, but it's also being played just in general because it obviously seems to be a very strong card. And now with the new release of the new Jigglypuff promo card, there seems to be a lot more Wigglytuff decks being played as well. I started to see a lot more of a play rate and a lot more of a top-in rate, as well as some interesting cooks, not just in the game in general. I posted a video where I had talked about decks you could build, and then I posted a second one where I actually built the decks and played them. And this deck is being tested a lot right now, and it's actually being tested in tournaments and doing very well. So the fact that this deck can stall your opponent out very easily with just the Wigglytuff. It also plays a Kangaskhan. Jigglypuff and a Kangaskhan, and then you can evolve the Jigglypuff into a Wigglytuff and continue to stall with sleep as well as hit in for decent damage and have 140 body on the Pokemon while you build up a Greninja in the back. You're obviously playing the water energy. You're not playing Misties, but I guess you don't really need them in this deck. And then you're just able to hit in for basically 100 damage a turn if your Greninja is online and your Wigglytuff is online. So it's a pretty cool deck, and I'm very interested to see where both Jigglypuff, Wigglytuff decks and Greninja decks go in the future. And with that being said, let's get in to the next deck. Now, this is possibly the most interesting cook I've seen as of yet. Again, it's another Jigglypuff promo card deck that just came out. Also placed very well. I believe this got second place in a tournament with 200 or more people. It is combining Wigglytuff and Executor. It's only playing one Jigglypuff and two Wigglytuff, and then two Execute and one Baby Executor and two Executor EX. I have it wrong on my deck list, but it is two Executor EX and one Baby Executor. This deck is really cool. It's super duper tanky. It's probably the two most tanky stage 2 cards in the game, if I'm not mistaken. And you're also stalling as well as tanking because you get to put your opponent's Pokemon to sleep with both Jigglypuff and Wigglytuff. And then if you start with the Executor, you just start to begin to attack in for potentially a lot of damage. This player is also playing one Giovanni, which I'm kind of shocked about because those breakpoints with Executor are kind of hard to find sometimes. However, it obviously paid off. And so the fact that you can tank really strongly with this deck, not just with the stall component of sleep, but with two stage 2s with a lot of HP, and then the Baby Executor with 130 HP. It's probably the three stage 2 decks with the most HP in the game. So you're able to really just like grind games out and get wins with this deck because you're able to take on so much damage while stalling with status conditions. You're also playing Erica, so you're also able to heal like crazy. It's very similar to the Wigglytuff Weezing deck, which is actually the next deck we're going to get into, where basically you're just stalling, and then either healing or bouncing back with a Koga. In fact, let's just get into that deck right now. So this is the deck. It's a Wigglytuff Weezing deck, and as I was saying, it's pretty similar to the Executor Wigglytuff deck, and the only difference is other than you're playing the Executor, is in the Executor build, you're playing Erica. So basically the strat is because you're stalling and tanking out for so long, what you're doing is you're even extending that by healing up your Executor with your Ericas. In the case of this type of deck, what you're doing is you're using Kogas as those healing factors on your Weezing. So basically you chip in for a ton of damage, which is 40 a turn because you're playing the Dark Energy, and then you're bouncing your Weezing back and denying them any prize cards. So I don't know which version is actually better because Executor has a higher HP count and can have a higher ceiling on attack, and then you heal it up with Erica's. However, this deck has a higher floor some of the time because it could do 40, whereas the Baby Executor could only do 30. And then you're bouncing back the Pokemon entirely and getting not just a free retreat, but also a free full heal. So it'd be interesting to see which one of these two decks is actually better. Last week I had said that the players had seemed to start to combine the Arbok Weezing deck with the Wigglytuff Weezing deck. Those decks are still doing pretty well. They have been seeing some interest in tops. I believe in top 16s, but I've definitely seen top 32s. But this deck here actually got 7th place in a 500 and I think 50-person tournament. And so it's interesting to see the tanky chip in for damage type decks where you can keep these tanky Pokemon on the field for a long time because of things like Erica, because of things like status conditions, and because of things like Kogas. Really seem to be an interesting strat. I still like the dark version of this deck a little bit better because you can put Arbok in there, and Arbok are just super duper good into a lot of the meta decks with Poison and Giovanni's. Arbok can two-shot almost anything relevant in the meta, with the exception of something like a Charizard. But you're one-shot in, two-shot in Pikachu's, two-shot in Zapdos's, two-shot in Starmie's, two-shot in Moltres' and Articuno's, you're two-shot in Mewtwo's, and you're even two-shot in Executors as well, with a mix of Poisons and Giovanni's with your Arbok, and you're locking them into place. So, but anyways, with that being said, let's get into the next deck. Speaking of Arbok and Weezing, this is an Arbok Weezing deck that mixes in the Grimer and Muck, because both the Muck and Weezing are advantageous in the same deck, because Koga can actually bounce not just the Weezing, but the Muck back as well. This is an interesting addition because Muck is able to do a 70 damage plus 50 more to any Pokemon that has poison on it. He's basically doing 120 damage to any Pokemon. But when you think about it, in order to get it, poisoned, you either have to, one, attack with the Grimer to poison it, or two, use the Gas Leak from Weezing, which means you've probably already gotten a turn of attack with the Weezing, meaning you've put a minimum of 50 damage counters, because 30 from its attack, and then 10 from finishing your turn, and then 10 from finishing theirs, which means on your next turn, if you bring in that Muck, because you got a free retreat with the Weezing from the Koga, that is doing 120 plus the 50 you already did, which is 170, plus an additional poison at the end of your turn. That's 180. That is taking out anything in the meta right now, with the exception of Venusaur. However, you are playing one Giovanni, and that's probably why this Giovanni is in the deck. It's also just very good with Arbok in general. This deck is only playing one Koga, which I found very odd because it's playing two potions. I'm not sure why they wouldn't just play the two Koga, considering you now have three targets. When people are mostly playing Weezing, you're already playing two Koga, so I'm not sure why you would play one less with an additional target for that Koga. Not that you would ever really want to bounce that Muck back, but you never know. You might absolutely need to deny them that prize card. There's only one Sabrina in this deck as well, which is also interesting. I mean, you obviously start to run out of space, but with Arbok, Muck, and Weezing, you have a lot of combo pieces, and I just feel like some combo pieces are missing. And so I would maybe take out the two potion, add, and maybe, honestly, maybe even add or remove the X speed, because the X speed is also not very needed when you have a free retreat in something like a Koga. So it's a very interesting deck and a very interesting thing to figure out what the ratios should be. But this deck obviously did pretty well, and this is a deck that people have been trying to play, and I guess it finally got a top, and so it'd be interesting to see where it goes, especially now with Charizard in. You might want something like a Muck to be able to take out those big Charizards on the board. And with that being said, let's get into the next deck. Next deck I want to talk about is a Machamp EX deck, and it's actually a Machamp deck because it's not only playing one copy of the Machamp EX, but it's also playing one copy of the Machamp. This deck also placed in a top 16 this past week in a 200 or more person tournament. Very interesting. So I expect to see at least one fighting deck in almost every top 16. You don't always see it, but with the amount of Pikachu being played, you obviously will or expect to see a lot of fighting. However, you don't see expect to see a lot of fighting that are weak to Psychic, considering Mewtwo is the majority of the meta, upwards to 30+% in every single tournament, and then the fact that it's like a tremendous amount of the top cut as well in most cases. However, this deck seems to be just saying, you know what, I'm not going to play any tanks like Kangaskhan in this deck, or even like a Weezing build, which most Stage 2 decks seem to want to do, is have some type of tank out in the front. What they're saying in this deck is, I'm just going to play the perfect curve that is Machamp. I'm going to get that Machop out there early on, and I'm just going to go for that perfect curve. And I'm assuming this player got that perfect curve very often. Again, when you get that perfect curve of Machop into Machoke into Machamp, they each take 1 energy for the Machop, 2 for the Machoke, and 3 for either of the Machamp, which means you're doing upwards to 190 damage with the Machamp EX and upwards to 170 damage with the baby Machamp. With a mixture of Giovanni's over those 3 turns, you are playing 2 Giovanni in this deck. You're basically going to knock out any Pokemon by the time you get up to that Machamp EX. And he also has 180 HP, which is nothing to scoff at. He's very hard to take out, and this card could get set up even faster than a Mewtwo, even with a Gardevoir. So it is possible that you might just be able to get that one up on most decks in those cases. You're also playing 1 copy of Hitmonlee, which is just a fantastic finisher. Once you get in for so much damage with this Stage 2 line, they are most players are going to retreat whatever Pokemon that you're attacking into, because their damage gets so low. If you get them within that 30-point damage range, that Hitmonlee can just clean up the board by attacking their bench. So this is a very interesting thing for fighting decks. I still think the best fighting deck right now is probably the Primeape Marowak EX, but that also has its issues to deal with as well. And so it'll be interesting to see what fighting decks are going to do to really try and make a splash into a meta scene as more than they are right now. These seem to be kind of all over the place with tons of different builds, whether it be this build with a Marowak EX, this build with a Mankey EX, Primate build, a Primate Marowak build, a Sand Slash Marowak build. There's so many different fighting builds right now, and nobody really seems to know which one is the top. But if you're able to get that perfect curve with this deck, like I'm assuming this player did often, you may just get into those top cuts with this deck. Now, with that being said, let's get into our final deck. Now, the last deck we want to talk about is very interesting. It's probably the most interesting cook on this list, actually, and it's playing 2, in my opinion, very bad Pokemon. I do not like Hypno, and I do not like Lapras. I think both of these cards are very bad cards. However, it did get 8th place in a 200 and I think 56-person tournament. It was like an all Brazilian tournament, and for a second I actually thought, like, hold on, am I looking at like one with like special rules? And there wasn't. You got to play any Pokemon you want. There was no banned Pokemon in this. It wasn't like a non-meta tournament. Like Mewtwo won the tournament. It was a Mewtwo EX deck, and all the other decks were being played, the Pikachu, the Charizard, all that. But yeah, I don't think Lapras EX is good. I actually have a whole video saying why I think it's very bad, and I absolutely despise Hypno. I think you have so many better options to try and put your opponent's Pokemon to sleep, especially with Jigglypuff now. You also have Frostmoth, which would probably just fit better in this deck. Anyways, I assume the person wanted to tech in a 1/1 line of this to try and get you to be put to sleep from the bench while still keeping something like a Lapras or Articuno in the front line. However, you are the one who has to do the coin flip in order to put your opponent to sleep. And anytime you're the one who has to flip the coin, eh, it's not for me. It's not for me. I've had way worse chances with Hypno than I have with the Jigglypuff or Frostmoth or Wigglytuff or something like that. However, this deck did very well, and you know what? If you can put your opponent to sleep from the bench while tanking with the Lapras and then hitting a Misty on your Lapras and healing up while keeping them asleep, it might be a very good combo. And so there's something there clearly because this person got 8th place in a 250 person plus tournament. And then when you mix in something like an Articuno, the cool thing about sleep and paralysis is even though you can't stack them, if your opponent's Pokemon is asleep and you attack with the Articuno and you flip a heads, you will still paralyze it. And then even if you don't, they still stay asleep if they flip tails because they still have to do the checkup for sleep if you didn't get the paralysis. So this is a super cool deck, and you know what, my whole channel, my whole thing is about cooking, and the fact that a cook like this was able to get 8th place in a 250 plus person tournament is super duper cool. These are the kind of decks I want to see. These are the kind of decks I want to cover, and I think a lot of people want to see interesting cooks. Honestly, a lot of my off-meta decks are the ones that get the most views on my channel. Anytime I post a video that's very commonly well known, I'm sure they've either seen it a million times and are sick of seeing it, or they just don't care and they would rather see something more cool and interested. In fact, let me know in the comments below, what kind of decks do you want to see? Do you want to see Mewtwo, Charizard, or the meta decks being posted on my channel, or do you want to see interesting cooks? It would be really cool to know. But with that being said, that is it for the top 10 decks of the week. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, and share. It would really help this small-time content creator out a lot. And with that being said, as always, keep cooking.